Hello and welcome to Safe as Houses. We're your hosts. I'm Alistair,
And I'm Kate.
and this is your guide on making houses safer, so it's you and not the next natural hazard that decides your future. In this episode, we're going to cover why you should consider natural hazards when buying a house, the 5 questions you should ask before making an offer, and how to balance risks and opportunities. So, Kate, we're buying a house. Do you know we're buying a house?
We're buying a house together.
We're buying a house. Together. No, we're not. But for the purposes of this episode, we're buying a house. Right. So what are we going to do? First of all, I'm sure we're going to log on to TradeMe or homes.co.nz or something like that. And we're going to have a look at what are we going to look at? Whether a house is close to work. Is it in a good school zone? Some people
What
look
about
at crime
price?
rates. Price probably will filter by price. We're going to look at a bunch of stuff as to buying this house. Anything that I haven't listed?
Well, I think it's really important to look for natural hazards. So
Ah,
wherever you knew that was coming, right?
I did.
I'd really hope so, given it's the topic of this podcast. So in New Zealand, it's pretty likely that somewhere at some point we're going to have an earthquake or a flood or a landslide or even a volcanic eruption. And these sorts of events can really disrupt our lives. They can even put our lives at risk depending on where we live. And if our homes gets damaged, it can be super disruptive to our everyday life. And at the same time, also cost us lots of money. Often our homes are our biggest investment financially. And so, because of that, we buy insurance. Insurance is another way to look after our homes as our financial assets. But what people don't think about is that when we have these like really large events like Cyclone Gabrielle that occurred, a few years ago, everyone's homes that have been damaged are also wanting to use like all of the same builders or all of the same plumbers or all of the same electricians. So the amount of time that it takes to repair our homes also gets pushed out. So when we know about these natural hazards that can affect our homes, we can be a whole lot better prepared for when they do happen.
Great. Well, I'm on board, surprise, surprise, about looking into natural hazards and when you're buying a home. All right, then. So if we're going to do that, though, what are the questions that we should be asking before, we look at the houses or before we make an offer?
Yeah, so I think if I was like, for a first home buyer looking at it, one of the things that you'll always kind of probably like consider is the area. Like, where do you want to live? But with that, I'd take kind of like a broad brush, like, approach and be like, what natural hazards can affect this area?
Yeah.
Okay. And actually identify what what potential hazards are at play when you're looking at that area. Because if you're looking at multiple areas, that might help you narrow down an area that you do and don't want to live in, because you might find out that one suburb is like so low lying that, anytime there's heavy rainfall, it floods. So that could actually help you define the areas that you're actually looking at houses in, because you don't want to fall in love with it before you've like had that initial first check.
Yeah. So I'm on Trade Me. Can I just like tick a box and then it will just show me where the hazards are?
No, unfortunately not. I wish that was
Oh,
the
the
case.
dream.
I think actually now you can see flood viewers on Trade Me for specifically Auckland. But for other natural hazards, definitely would recommend having a look at your council's hazard viewers. One of the easiest ways to do that is just Google natural hazards and the areas that you're looking into. And most councils will tend to have some sort of hazard information available. So then once you've used a hazard portal to kind of figure out what natural hazards are around the different areas, and you've found a house that you want to look at, what are we going to do, Alistair?
I think if you've got one that fits kind of your general risk understanding, the next thing to do would be to have a look and see if the property's actually ever been affected by a natural hazard. And the way you can do that is you can go on to naturalhazardsportal.govt.nz. This is quite a cool viewer, so it shows where past insurance claims that have been handled by the Natural Hazards Commission are all shown on a map across the country. This is really helpful just to understand whether something's been affected by a natural hazard in the past. It's only a small kind of window from 1997 to present, but that's quite helpful if, for example, a property's been repeatedly impacted by a landslide or something like that. If you've seen multiple events, then you can kind of get a sense that it might be a bit of an active environment. The other thing that it's really helpful for is just understanding if any action has been taken following natural hazard events as well. So you can kind of check out, oh, they did put in a brand new retaining wall, and I can see that's because they had a landslide, for example. And then, you can subsequently do some research into that to make sure that that's all safe and sound now and you're comfortable with that, with the remediations that have taken place. Something else I think you can do as well is the buzzword of the moment, AI, is also quite good. You can actually use AI to look up properties now and the area and actually get a really good understanding of have there been past natural hazard events there that might not surface in some of these things. Because, for example, the property may not have made an insurance claim. And just because they haven't made an insurance claim doesn't mean it wasn't impacted by an event. It's also quite good for you to understand things like where streets were flooded, for example. So you can kind of have a look back at past records that might be available online. And newspapers are great for this sort of thing. And AI is really helpful in terms of searching through all of that. So you can say, oh, the street outside the property was flooded. And that might be important to you because, for example, you might want or need access in and out of your property. So kind of getting a sense of broader natural hazard events that have actually impacted the area as well. It's just a really good sense check as well, because sometimes natural hazards are hard to comprehend. You kind of go, oh, there's a flood area or or whatever kind of hazard. And then it's kind of hard to understand. You kind of think, well, the river's all the way over there, or I don't see any water source here. So how on earth could it get that bad? So actually seeing pictures of what an area has been like in the past can be really helpful for that.
Mm. I would also, I guess I want to add in a disclaimer that I'd also be really like careful in terms of like validating that information.
Yes.
Because I think there is, you know, I don't think there's 100% accuracy at the moment with AI. So I'd be using it as kind of like a broad brush, like general, rather than making like decisions based off that information. And I think, if you are looking for a firm decision, I would be relying more on those council hazard portals.
Yeah, I find AI to just be a really good search tool to collate things that you might not know the sources for. So following through to those sources to actually check what it's saying. Sometimes we all know AI does this thing called hallucination, i.e., it lies to you,
Yeah.
and you've got to tell it it's wrong sometimes. So yeah, it's a really powerful way to search. And another thing that I found quite helpful in the past when I've been looking for properties actually is Google Street View. Sometimes Google Street View or Google Images has actually had photos in relation to events in the past. So that's also could be another powerful search engine that doesn't come to top of mind to get a sense of the kind of impacts that a property might have seen from a natural hazard.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a really good one, especially for Google Street View, is to look at like the site elevation without
Yeah.
having to go and view heaps of different houses. You can actually check out a house from Street View to be like, oh, is it like downhill? Is water going to potentially flow towards it? You could potentially get an eye on like the foundations of like how high you think it might be off the ground level before you actually, I guess, invest your time in going to look at these houses as well. So often if a friend's sending me a house to have a look at, I'd like go to Street View to also look at the section and like the property and where it is in relation to the road, mostly around, I guess, that flood aspect.
So, Kate, surely that the government holds some information about properties.
Yeah, so each of your councils has what they call a land information memorandum, otherwise known as a LIM. I think most people call them limb reports. So these you can purchase from your local council, and they hold all the natural hazards information that they have on your property. So it's kind of like any information that they've held over however long, it all kind of gets compiled into this document. Also around, like all your past building consents and your the plans and stuff, but it's got this natural hazard section. And so that's another, I guess, form of information. I'd say they kind of cost like a couple of $100. So it is a little bit more expensive, probably worth it when you're like really investigating like one specific site. Some of the things I would definitely do when you do get a limb report is if there's something of concern, read the report that is connected to that piece of information, because potentially if you do a little bit of digging and understand what that information is saying, you can potentially be like better informed as well. So anything that goes on a council's like district plan has to be included, but district plans only get updated kind of every 10 years or so unless there's a change plan. So some of that information in some circumstances can be a little bit outdated.
Yeah. I found limbs super helpful, and if anything's been reported to the council, it's on there. So for example, I've looked at properties where there was a bit of street flooding or water rushing down, and the council had to then go out and fix that. Similarly, with like a little bit of landslide beneath the property that maybe impacted a road, all of those things are logged. So there's a list so that you kind of get an understanding of what the council's experience of natural hazards in respect to that property
Yeah.
is. So that's really helpful. Also, I live in Wellington, and when I was house hunting in Wellington, a lot of the estate agents already had that limb. So that's quite helpful to kind of give you a good starting point, so you can reference the limb that's been provided to you. The estate agent hasn't necessarily offered that up straight away. You can often ask, and that might be something that the property owner is already looking to obtain to provide to prospective buyers. I would just caution on that. It's really helpful to kind of get a good sense check and to get you most of the way. But you've got to be aware, if you're using a limb that's, say, 5 years old, the council may have more information on that property or more up to date natural hazard modelling or council zoning. There's a whole load of issues that the limb covers that you should be aware of. So don't rely fully on an older limb. Then, if you're serious about purchasing the property, that's something that it would be worth in your due diligence actually purchasing and getting a lawyer to also look through as well.
Yeah.
So, Kate, we've done all of this and we haven't even left our couches, which is quite awesome. But we've found a property that ticks our boxes, that meets our requirements. So, shall we go take a look at the house?
Totally. So important to take a look at a house. There's only so much that Google Street View can do. You've actually got to go and look at it. And I think that's also, when you start to like fall in love with a property or, can evaluate it if it's an investment property.
Yeah.
Um,
So, when we're looking at the house, what are we looking for in terms of natural hazards?
yeah. So one of the first things I'd look for is kind of like what's around it, or like even where is it built? So is it on like a hillside? What does that mean in terms of landslide risk? Is it at the top or a bottom of a section for water to come towards it? That's kind of like your initial setup for like looking at the house when you arrive on the section. And then the things that you're kind of wanting to look at from the outside is like, what are the foundations?
Yeah.
What are they made of? Because that's really important when it comes to like how a building's going to respond to earthquake shaking. Another thing with earthquake shaking is looking at bracing. Hey,
Yeah. So we're not just looking anymore at like where the house is situated. We're thinking about how the house itself is actually built, because that also has an effect, particularly in respect to earthquakes. So thinking about the elements in the house and that are part of the house that could be damaged by earthquake shaking is going to be a key one. So I often do think about the type of foundation, whether we are bolted and braced so that we're ready for an earthquake shaking, whether there's like heavy things up high, like a chimney that could fall through the ceiling. All of those sorts of things are really, really important to the house and how it will perform in an earthquake, and whether there would be any damage as a result of an earthquake.
Mm. So one of the other things that you can look at is also like how high it's built off the ground, just in terms of is there flood risk nearby. But when we're talking about the things that you can look for, it's like knowing what hazards can actually affect it. Because if it's high on a hill, then you probably don't need to worry about if the floor is higher, because you're probably not going to have that issue, right? All houses, you're definitely going to look at for earthquakes. And these are also things that you can ask, if you're not an expert in yourself, is like ask your building inspector, or if you're buying a builder's report, to specifically look for. Some of the things they will do quite naturally, like they will check that your hot water cylinder is like attached to the wall, but there's some additional checks that you could ask for or add in that's just going to give you that next layer of insurance, from someone that has like that expertise that, you may not.
Yeah. And one very significant hazard that we haven't really spoken about is landslides. There are a couple of little tricks you can do just to kind of check the landslide risk. I've walked into a house and it just hasn't felt quite right, Kate. I don't know what it
Mm.
was. I was like, oh, what is this? And then I put a coin on the floor and it rolled out the door. um,
Yeah.
that's a really good one to kind of know if the house is starting to tilt. It probably wasn't built on a tilt to start with. So something's happening in the movement of the land over time. So that's definitely worth following up on, as is any kind of door jamming. So if doors aren't quite moving correctly, that's also a sign that the house might be under strain as a result of land movement. So these are things to look out for. And so recommend you get that building report that Kate mentioned. And then also you can request a geotechnical report, and that will look at the land around and on underneath the property to see the suitability and if there's anything to be wary of there.
So would you recommend a geotechnical report for any house, Alistair?
I wouldn't for any house. I think that's not the most common thing to do. I think it depends on your risk appetite as well. It's actually an area that I understand less than others, and I think many people do. I think geotechnical reports can absolutely surface up important things for properties, but it would be something that I would be much more interested in if the property was on a steep hill slope, or if the property has like exposed foundations on a steep slope or has a steep slope nearby.
So we've like talked about buying a house that's like already there, right? But
Yeah.
people may also be looking at buying a section of land. And so, we're wanting to probably go through those same, processes. But if you have the ability to, build your own home, which is such an incredible dream for so many people, is you can also start looking at how you build your home in a way that, reduces these impacts of these natural hazard events as well. So for when you are building it, there are like, I guess, additional requirements through that like resource and, building consent process. But definitely something to talk to your architect or your builder or your spec home builder about is how you can build in those things.
Great.
Okay. And last but not least, Alistair, what should you always check for, if possible, before buying a home?
Oh, definitely always possible to check for whether there will be insurance and then how much that will cost, or get a sense of how much that will cost, because availability for insurance is an absolute requirement unless you're buying all in cash to get a mortgage. And you want to make sure that you can afford that insurance as part of, as the package. And insurance does, to an extent, reflect risk. So it not only reflects natural hazard risk, but it's a huge component of that price. So making sure that you can afford the risk that you're taking on in that sense is really important.
Mm. And I think, when you're looking at buying a house, you're like usually accessing like, is this affordable for me and my lifestyle? And insurance is such a big ongoing cost as well. And I think for in my personal experience, like my insurance costs have been going up every single year as well. So you just want to make sure that that's like really manageable for you, to make sure that your house is also fitting your lifestyle as well.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. So that's the five things, that's the five questions that you need to ask. Another thing that I think is worth throwing into this conversation is, what does the risk kind of mean to us? So it is always a balancing act buying a house. It's balancing that location, price, lifestyle, all those different bits and pieces. But I think what I really want to emphasize, and we've kind of touched on it, is that it's really helpful to have an understanding of natural hazards before you head along and you find a beautiful white picket fence, quarter-acre dream that's on a fault line with a landslide about to fall on it that floods every other day. It doesn't sound quite so good when you add that extra caveat on the end there, does it, Kate?
No, it definitely doesn't, especially when you throw in so many different hazards to the mix. I would like definitely not be buying that property myself.
And I think a lot of this comes back to balancing when a hazard is manageable for you and when it's a deal breaker.
Yeah.
Because understanding that low likelihood to this happening doesn't mean there's no likelihood to this happening,
Yes.
and low likelihood could happen like tomorrow. So trying to work out like what level of that is a deal breaker for you. So some people can deal with nuisance flooding, but the chance of having a 3-meter flood where their house is something that would be a deal breaker for them. So all of these things are a bit of a balancing act there in terms of what's manageable for you.
100%. And I think also it does also depend on that stage of life as well. Like there's so many different factors that come into play when we're making that decision. But it is good to have that in mind before you start looking at a house for sure.
So,
Yes.
in this episode, you've heard why you should consider natural hazards when buying a house, the 5 questions you should ask before making an offer, and then how to weigh risk and opportunity. So, please give us a follow and a share. Contact us to share what you've done so you are safe as houses. And before we go, a quick reminder that everything we've shared in this episode is based on our personal views and experience. We always recommend doing your own due diligence and seeking advice specific to your situation before making any decisions. We'll catch you next time.